Welcome to all those joining us all over the world. I get a chance each week to look at our analytics to see where people are joining in from. And it's crazy to see people really are joining us from all over the world. So welcome from all over the world. And even welcome to you who thinks that no one's watching you. We see you. Well, not really, but the internet does see you. And so we're starting a new series today, and we're calling this series Recovery Road, because we know there's going to be some recovery that needs to start happening in our world and in our society. And periodically, we as the church have the opportunity to kind of have these things set on a silver platter for us, and they're set like a big softball on a tee where we can discuss them. And sometimes, honestly, real honestly, it'd be easier just to open our Bibles to the book of Romans and just start preaching and just say, let's go verse by verse. But sometimes events happen in the world, and it lends itself to us hitting the pause button on the expository preaching and tackling what's going on in our current world. Now, I do want to say something, though, about that. It doesn't mean that we should become or that we're going to become the church of current events. That's not what we want to do. We don't want to take the latest headlines and just preach about those, because you aren't interested in that, and I'm nowhere near smart enough to be able to do that. But every once in a while, something does come along that we do need to talk about. When it disrupts our life and it takes us by storm, which is what is happening now and today in our world. We want to talk about it in the church, because here's what I know. You have an opinion. I have an opinion about all that's going on, and Jesus has an opinion. Wait, what? Jesus has an opinion on all this? Yeah. Everything that's going on, this COVID-19 stuff, that the fact that we've almost forgotten that there's an election coming in the fall, the stimulus packages, all the jobs, finances, Jesus has actually spoken into this and gives us the opportunity to learn what he says. And as a pastor, I feel it's my responsibility to help us remember what Jesus has said to help us recover to the new normal, whatever that's going to be. And so if I had a magic button and I could just kind of hit pause on that magic button on everyone's church service that they're having today or right now, and kind of speak into that church service, like if I was just had that magic like Big Brother button that would come in over the house and would just say this: don't miss this opportunity. Don't miss this opportunity, because this is an incredible opportunity. Let's don't make the same mistakes that the previous generations have made before us and accidentally look at our faith through the lens of this crisis. Let's be unique. Let's be a generation that takes this crisis and looks at it through the lens of our faith. Because if we do that, if we filter this crisis, what we're going through the lens of our faith, we'll start to see some crazy things. We'll actually start to see unity happening. We'll actually start to see solutions for the future. So what does that mean? What does it mean to filter everything in this crisis through the lens of our faith? How do we do that? Well, first off, I'm going to ask you to do some things for me today. I'm going to ask you to do some things. If you call yourself a Christian, which I would guess most of you who are watching this would say that you're a Christian, I'm going to first ask you to do this. I'm going to ask you to lay aside your political views. I'm going to ask you to set, whether you're a Republican, whether you're a Democrat, whether you're an independent, whether you're sitting there saying, well, libertarians are in the middle and everybody should be a libertarian, or whether you're saying, I don't really care. I'm asking you to set all that aside. Secondly, I'm going to ask you to set aside another thing. I'm going to ask you to set aside your feelings about this pandemic. I'm going to ask you to set aside your opinions about this pandemic, whether you think everybody should be living in a bubble, or whether we should be getting back to work, whether you think we should shelter in place more, or whether you think I can't shelter in place because if I do, I won't have a shelter to place in. Whether you think everybody should wear a mask, or whether you think a mask makes it worse. Whether you think we're all going to die from this, or you're sitting there saying, we got to die somehow. I want to ask you to set those aside today and ask this famous question. This question that came about when I was in high school and we all wore the bracelets. WWJD. What would Jesus do? But more importantly, I want to ask you to ask this question, because this is a little bit different. And this one I'm adding a few letters into it, and I'm not going to try to do the acronym, but this one is, what would Jesus have me do? What would Jesus have me do? Because here's the thing. What could and what should the church do with this opportunity? Now, when I say the church, I don't want you to think of the building. I don't want you to think of where I'm standing in the building. I want you to think of you. What could and should the church, you, do with this opportunity? Because if we can set aside those things, if we can not view our current situation through the lens of our politics, through the lens of whatever, because we can get all that during the week for various news channels, we can get all that on Facebook, and I'll just say, those are really terrible places to get informed. They really are. But we can make the most of this opportunity and leverage our future. If we can make the most of this opportunity and leverage our future, we will view this crisis as a stepping stone rather than a stepping back. But here's the key. Here's what we have to understand about all this. That recovery, it doesn't begin in Washington. And it doesn't start at our state capitol, just a little south of here. And it'll never, and it won't begin by watching clips that have been spliced together to fit a certain narrative. Are you ready for this? I'm going to let the cat out of the bag this morning, okay? I'm going to let you know the secret sauce of recovery. You ready? Hold on. The secret sauce to recovery is this. Recovery starts with me. Recovery starts with me. That's right. It doesn't start with they. It begins with me. It begins right here where you are sitting. It starts with you. It starts with us. And I'll just say this because I'm a pastor and I believe in the church. It especially starts in the church. And if the church can lead the way, if the church can start this charge and say, hey, recovery begins right here, it's going to change some things. And by the way, anything that the church leads the way in, it changes things. That's a different story, a different sermon for a different day. But I don't want to pull the wool over your eye or try to give you a bait and switch in this and try to give you some things that aren't realistic or anything about these next few weeks that we're going to be talking about this because I want to be honest with you because this is going to be some very difficult for some of us to hear. Okay, it's going to be very difficult to swallow, and you might be tempted to turn this off or just keep scrolling or just keep, just like, well, I don't know about that all, Pastor. That's I just don't know if it begins with me. But here's what I want to do. I want to sincerely ask you over the course of these next few weeks that we're going to talk about recovery. I want to ask you to come in with an open mind and an open heart to hear from God. And look, it's going to be hard, okay? Today, probably the hardest of them all, if we're honest. Because I'll tell you this. Today was hard for me to write. Today's message was hard for me to swallow because it's a lot of my problems. I often write my sermons to myself many times. When I first start out, I'm like, what would Mickey hear in this? What would Mickey want to hear? What does Mickey need to hear in this? And then I'll take it and I'll kind of rewrite it and say, that was probably a little too harsh, or that wasn't harsh enough, or I'll say, that really doesn't fit the context of the large body. And so, but today, I wrote this sermon from the perspective of this is strictly to me. Because that causes a lot of self-examination. And so I want to invite you, as I talk about me today, because it begins with me, recovery begins with me. So as I talk about me today, I want to ask you to be honest with yourself. Because here's the thing that I know, and here's the thing that I've seen over the course of the last 9 weeks that we've been, 10 weeks that we've been just in quarantine and in shelter in place and all this other stuff, and we haven't been able to have church. Here's and just talking to people, here's what I've seen. If we were to sit down and we were completely honest about our situation, everything that's going on, just completely honest, got it all out on the table, many of you would admit that what bothers you the most about this crisis, what makes you most concerned about this crisis is not your health. It's not whether you get sick or not. It has everything to do with how much money you have in your bank account. You're concerned about going broke. Not getting sick. Because here's what we say when we talk about this. If I get sick, how can I pay for it? If I get sick, I won't be able to go back to work and make a living. You see, the panic inside of us isn't because we're worried about getting sick. It's because we're worried about going broke. The root of this crisis is not a health risk. The root of what has made this a crisis is not even financial. The root of this crisis is what I call a Twinkie problem. You know, when we see the Twinkies on the shelf and we got to have them. We have a spending problem. I have a spending problem. I'm sure we've all heard the stories of the athlete that makes all this money, you know, millions and millions of dollars, and we hear these stories of they're going broke. And we figure like, what? How do they go broke? They made so much money. Or the company that's been on top for so long. And we're hearing about stories right now about these companies that are filing for bankruptcy. And they end up going bankrupt. And you're like, what? Or the lottery winner. There was a famous lottery winner in England. And his name happened to be Michael Carroll. And he's so famous because he just blew all his money on drugs and women and alcohol and just lavish lifestyle. And so I actually watched a documentary one night, and my dad texted me and says, hey, you should watch this thing. It's about us. And I'm like, I wish, because here's what I say during that. I would never lose that much money. There's no way I could blow, there's no way. But see, our problem in America is not having enough. It's managing what we have. We have simply ignored the fundamentals and principles year after year after year, and we think it'll just all work out by itself. That if I can make more money, if I just get a little bit more in my bank account, if I just get that raise, this will all work itself out. Yet all while still making poor fundamental accounting decisions and wondering, how in the world do we get here when it all catches up to us? Because here's what I know. It's going to catch up to us. If you go back and you study the recession from a few years back, about 12 years back, you'll see the reason the recession happened is because of the poor financial decisions of spending that companies and people made and choices they made year after year, and it caught up to us. I don't want to be in that boat. So today, I want to do some self-diagnosis. I've done some self-diagnosis this week as I was preparing for this message, as I was writing this message. And so I'm going to let you in on that self-diagnosis. And so I want you to do the same. Because here's the thing. What I'm going to tell you is I struggle with what we're going to talk about today. I struggle. This is hard for me. And before you start throwing stones at other people, and before you start thinking about, yeah, this person does this and that person does this, I want to invite you to remember that recovery starts with me. Recovery starts with you. And Jesus actually said something about this in Matthew about recovery, and it's starting with me. And let's just read that and let's just let this soak in for a second. Let's read this. Matthew 7, verse 3 says, "Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, 'Let me take the speck out of your eye,' when all the time there's a plank in your own eye?" And then Jesus gets really personal. He starts calling us names. He says, "You hypocrite, first take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye." So today, I want to be extremely transparent with you and give you insight on what has caused financial burden and financial crisis in my life, caused pain from the dumb decisions that I've made. From these 4 things. And this is my list. You're going to have your list. And by the end of today, I expect you to have a good list. Some of these things may be on your list. You may have something different. But ultimately, this is how I've abused my prosperity that God has blessed me with. The first one I'd tell you this is I have a discipline problem. I have a discipline problem. Now, we understand discipline problems, don't we? We can spot it on someone else's kids from a mile away immediately. You know, that parent says, "No, you can't have that." And the kid says, "I want it." And they say, no, you say, "I want it." And then they pitch a fit. And ultimately, the kid, what? Gets it anyway. That's a discipline problem. Because we don't like to hear no. Look, I don't like to hear no. So what do? I reach into the future. And I leverage my future because I want that car. I reach into the future and I put that thing on a credit card because I want it. And I do that under the pretense, well, I deserve this. I've worked hard. Or I got to have a new car. Like my car is breaking down. It's got however many miles on it. It's got 3 dents in the side. For me running it down a hill, I need a new car. Like Bob Barker would say. Like I have a discipline problem where I can't keep that under control. You know, the funny thing is in this, it's funny because whenever we have more than what we need, we're never going to be disciplined with it. It's just a principle of what we have. And you know why that is? Because discipline isn't fun. Even the Bible tells us that. Look what Hebrews 12:11 says. It says, no discipline seems pleasant at the time, but painful. Nobody likes pain. I don't like pain. You don't like pain. But later on, however, it produces a harvest of righteousness and peace for those who have been trained by it. I have a discipline problem, which leads me to my next problem is I have an entitlement problem. You know what the old-fashioned word for entitlement is? Spoiled. Or in the South, as we say, spoiled. But I'm spoiled. You know what happens when you try to take something from a rich person who thinks they're entitled to it? You know what happens when that, what happens? It's the same thing that happens when you take something from a poor person that think they're entitled to it. It's the same thing that happens when you take something from a middle-class person that thinks they're entitled to it. It's the same thing that happens when you take something from a 4-year-old who thinks they're entitled to it. They whine and they complain about why you owe me this, or why they owe me this, or why the government owes me this. Barry Switzer, a famous football coach. He coached for the Dallas Cowboys for a while, coached in college, won national championship in college, won a Super Bowl. He's one of the only coaches that can say that. He said this about entitled people or people that feel like they're entitled. It says, it's people who were born on third base and think they hit a triple. I love that because it's so true. People that are born on third base and they think they're the ones that hit the triple. But you know what that does? That really describes us here in America. And look, don't get me wrong, and don't hear me wrong in this. I am honored to be an American. And I love the fact that I get to call America home. And honestly, I would have never wanted to be born anywhere else. Because here's the thing. We have so much. And have been given so much just because we were born here. And look, I understand there's people here who have more than others. I get that. I get that. But I've been to third world countries. And I've seen how they live. And I've walked into their houses where they have 10, 12, 15 people living in a house that's smaller than the house that I park my cars in. And you come back and you look at all you have and you feel guilty. It's not an indictment. It's not any kind of criticism. It's just an observation. And so you come home and you say, I'm going to sell this. I'm going to get rid of it. I'm going to live simple. We have so much here, and that we haven't been disciplined with, which leads us to the fact that we've become entitled. We feel like we're owed it. But it's ultimately because I have a greed problem. I have a greed problem. You see, greed is it's the assumption that everything that comes my way is for my consumption. It's that everything that gets put in my hands is for me to spend. It's the thing that I say, hey, that's mine. I just need to spend it. And look, here's the thing. I know in the church that we have created a false narrative that says as long as you give, you can do whatever you want to with the rest. That is not true. 100%, that is not true. God doesn't say as long as you give 10%, you can go spend the 90 however. I can't do that. I can't just go out and spend. I'm a steward of everything that God gives me, not just 10%. That's a terrible mindset. And look, here's the thing. And I don't want to get legalistic about this, and I know it could lend itself to some legalistic thoughts in this. But the last time you bought that car, the last time you bought that boat, the last time you bought those shoes, did you bother to ask God about it? Or did you just say, I want to go get a new car? I want some new shoes. And look, don't get legalistic about all that, because I understand, look, none of those things are bad to have. None of those things are bad to have. But want us to see, what I want us to see is that because we have so much, that our greed will never be satisfied with the next purchase. Did you know that the wealthiest people in the world give the least amount of money as far as percentages go? That the more you have, the more greedy you will be. I think every year, and I'll talk about this because we're in an election year, and so later on this year, you're gonna hear this talk about tax returns, about these politicians that want to get elected. You're going to hear this talk about their tax returns and how much they made and how much taxes they paid. Look. Frankly, I could give a rip about their finances, to be honest with you, but that's just me. But you're going to hear about it, and inevitably, they're always going to bring up how much money they gave away, and you'll see in there like exorbitant amounts, dollar amounts, right? Like they gave away $300,000 last year to whatever charity. And to our undisciplined, to our entitled, greedy minds, we want to pat them on the back. And we want to say, wow, look how generous they are. But to God, you know what they say? Look how greedy they are, because that top line, the adjusted gross income that says $100 million, and they only gave $300,000 away, that's like if I was hungry and you had $1,000 and you gave me 30 cents. That's not very generous, is it? Jesus actually spoke into this, and he said this in Mark 12. He said, Jesus sat down opposite the place where the offerings were put, and watched the crowds putting their money into the temple treasury, which is kind of weird if you ask me, but he's Jesus and I'm not. Many rich people threw in large amounts. So they're coming and they're just throwing in exorbitant amounts of money. You know, they're giving that 300K. It says this, verse 42 is, but a poor widow came and put in 2 very small copper coins with only a few cents, calling his disciples to him. Jesus said this, and listen, this is awesome. Truly, I tell you, this poor widow has put more into the treasury than any others. They all gave out of their wealth, but she, out of her poverty, put everything in, all she had to live on. Man, what a testament. God doesn't just want a little bit. He wants it all. And what holds us back, what holds me back, is what I want. That I want that new shiny. Because ultimately, my last problem that I'm going to tell you about today, and of course I got a bunch more, but this is the last one we're going to talk about today. I have a failure of nerve problem. I fear the consequences of the solution. What will happen if I have to tell myself no? With that little guy inside of me. You know, that undisciplined, greedy person that lives inside of me, he's going to come out. And what will happen if others think that I don't have it all together? What will happen if I can't impress those people that I really don't really care about their opinion anyway? What if I'm seen as someone I'm not? Oh, wait. That's what's happening. You see, I don't want to confront that little guy inside of me. So I have a failure of nerve problem. I have a failure of nerve problem. I don't want to tell myself no. So I want to bring this back for full circle today as we kind of get to the end of this, because I know this is, you've probably heard this, you've probably been like, wow, Mickey, you really struggle with that. But I want you to look at your list. What's on your list? Because for you, recovery doesn't begin with me, it begins with you. For me, recovery begins with me. Getting back to the new normal depends upon what I do with what God's blessed me with. So what's on your list? Is it similar? Do you need to add some things? Do you need to subtract some things? What does it look like? Because recovery begins with you. Recovery begins with me. Recovery ultimately begins right here in my heart. Remember what Jesus said. He said, first, take the plank out of your own eye. And so today, recovery begins with me. Father, I thank you for the truth of your word. God, those sometimes hard to hear and sometimes piercing. As your word says, that it's sharper than a two-edged sword. But God, I thank you for conviction. God, in these moments, in these days, in these weeks, as we start to open back up, as we start to recover, God, help us not look to they. Help us not look to someone else in an office somewhere miles away. God, help us look right here at our heart and understand that recovery begins right here, right now. Father, thank you for your truth. In your name, amen.